cacciando per gustar di quel tesoro. Per aspri monti e boschi perigliosi d'uno scala. Ai tentai sopra vettai sfere mai rotto all'ancora fiosa.
Welcome to Chapter 2, Episode 4, Boccaccio's Story. Last time we explored the Ars Nova and the work of Guillaume de Machaut through works connected to two important crises of the 14th century. A crisis in the conception of the self and of humankind's relation to the divine, as well as the crisis of the Black Death. This time, we will encounter an Italian musical work from the early 15th century, in the period after the Black Death devastated Europe. It's a lively work full of humor in an important musical form of the late Middle Ages. And as a way into understanding this work and the world of Europe in the wake of the Black Death, we're going to start with Boccaccio's story.
Boccaccio's Decameron is one of the most important texts to help us understand the Black Death because in many respects it reflects the reality of what was happening at the time, which was that wealthy families in Florence had fled the city for the countryside. And what's interesting about Florence is that as hard hit as it was by the plague, once the city fathers got their feet back under them, they did an amazing job of trying to restore normalcy. And one thing they did is say, hey, all you nobles out there in the countryside who are not here helping us fix stuff, you've got to come on back. Because if you don't, we're going to fine you. And so they were trying to restore order. And Florence went ahead and set up its first board of health, the first board of health in arguably the medieval world, to try and cope with subsequent outbreaks of plague. So the Decameron shows us how nobles reacted to the plague and how they fled. At the same time, it is a literary masterpiece and brilliantly conceived in that Boccaccio did what something like the 1001 Nights had done before, which is find a way to take a bunch of different stories that have nothing to do with one another in terms of subject matter, time period, genre, comedy, tragedy, whatever, and he managed to put them all together in one text. And that was Chaucer's inspiration for the Canterbury Tales. Another text of Boccaccio's, Il Filostrato, was also Chaucer's inspiration for his Knight's Tale in the Canterbury Tales. So the work that Boccaccio did while he himself was sheltering from the plague is incredibly important in the influence it had on later writers and on the arts and literature as a whole in medieval Europe.
Boccaccio's story, this masterpiece called The Decameron, written as Professor Armstrong says, while Boccaccio himself was sheltering from the plague, tells a story about telling stories. Imagine, if you will, an uncontrollable pandemic is raging through Europe, baffling doctors and devastating the population. And 7 beautiful women in their 20s decide to escape the threat of the terrifying disease in Florence. They agree they want the company of men, so they invite 3 good-looking young men, strangers in fact, to join them in a retreat to a villa outside the city, lush with gardens and fountains, and stocked with food and wine. Together they resolve to amuse themselves with the pleasures of the place and the pleasures of music, dance, and storytelling. Such is the setting for Boccaccio's story. Giovanni Boccaccio started composing the Decameron midway through his life's journey, after the Black Death began sweeping over Europe in 1348, when he was 35 years old. He had lived much of his life in Naples until that time, where he had written a number of poems in Italian, decidedly medieval in language, content, and character. When he started writing the Decameron, back in and around Florence, he started a friendship with Francesco Petrarca, who would lead him to producing scholarly works in Latin. He was inspired throughout his life by Dante, and in fact might be considered the first Dante scholar. As Professor Wayne Rebhorn writes in his lucid introduction to the Decameron, in short, the Decameron was written at a time when, perhaps without knowing it, Boccaccio was ending his career as a medieval poet and beginning one as a Renaissance scholar. At that time, from 1348 forward, the Black Death was sweeping in waves over Europe. By 1351, the pandemic had devastated populations. Though exact figures are hard to determine, the Black Death, in these relentless waves, killed between 75 million and 200 million people in Europe over those 3 years, or somewhere between 40 and 60% of the total population. In Florence alone, 50 to 80,000 people perished, with as much as 80% of the population dying. The disease shattered lives, families, and economies, and profoundly transformed society. Out of this catastrophe rose innovative forms of artistic expression. Though the practice of memento mori, Latin for remember you will die, originated in antiquity, the experience of the Black Death made this idea clear and present in the minds of survivors. One expression of this theme was the much debated and variously dated 14th century Triumph of Death in the Campo Santo in Pisa, which gives an epic expression to the power of death. Though severely damaged in World War II, the fresco vividly portrays how none escape death. Though in the lower right, a gathering of women retreat to a verdant garden, much like in Boccaccio's story. Later artists took up this tradition in the coming centuries, such as this unique 15th century fresco from the Palazzo Sclafani in Palermo, depicting a spectral death on horseback massacring revelers. And this celebrated oil painting from the 16th century by the Dutch artist Peter Bruegel the Elder, now in the Prado Museum in Madrid, portraying through the antics of an army of skeletons the inevitability for all of death. Boccaccio opens his story with a vivid literary depiction of the terrifying historical reality of the Black Death, beginning with the sentence, "It is a matter of humanity to show compassion for those who suffer." As he unrolls his description of the Black Death, its gruesome effects, rapid spread and sudden deaths, corpses that piled up and families that had no chance to say goodbye, he notes, "It had begun some years before in the East, where it deprived countless beings of their lives before it headed to the West, spreading ever greater misery as it moved relentlessly from place to place. Against it, all human wisdom and foresight were useless." It is in this context that the 7 young women and 3 young men meet up in the Florentine church of Santa Maria Novella and decide to escape the threat of the plague together amidst the pleasures of a Tuscan villa. The name Decameron is Greek for 10 days, describing the agreement of these 10 young people to entertain one another during the heat of Tuscan summer afternoons, with each of them telling 10 stories over 10 days. The resulting 100 stories they tell are set throughout Florence, Italy, Europe, and the Mediterranean, and they vary from comic to tragic, ridiculous to sublime. They range across social classes, and they celebrate human ingenuity, wit, intelligence, and cunning, as well as struggles against fortune, the vagaries of desire, and the capacity for compassion. We don't have time to delve into these stories now, but we encourage you to explore the great bounty, the beauty, abundance, humor, and vitality of this marvelous collection of stories. Recommended digital and print versions are listed in our program booklet, linked in the comments below. Boccaccio's Decameron and its structure contrast the terrifying historical reality of the plague to the human capacity for innovation, ingenuity, perseverance, wit, charm, humor, creativity, and compassion. In contrast to the chaos of the real-world plague, the stories, as literature and the arts so often do, offer meaning, laughter, and hope. Flowing through these stories is the energy of life, of youth, and quite explicitly of sex. They celebrate joy, pleasure, desire. In short, they celebrate the experience of being human and living in this world with a great joie de vivre. And it is that same energy of life and renewal that we will experience this episode in the music of Zacara da Teramo's Caccia per gustar.
Antonio Zacara da Teramo was a leading composer of the 14th and 15th centuries, working mostly in Rome for Pope Gregory, but then, apparently, for the anti-Pope John XXIII in Bologna. His music appears in the Squarcialupi Codex, a collection from the Republic of Florence that was meant to rival the best of the French musical tradition. Among Zacara's many distinctions is that he composed what is probably the last known caccia, a hunting song, wherein the voices chase each other. In fact, it seems that this caccia clearly borrows from the French song form chasse, or chase. The Italians were influenced by the latest of developments in France, which included the successor to the ars nova called the ars subtilior, a more intricate and complex form of musical notation, rather like the flamboyant style in architecture, wherein, for example, intricate tracery, the ornamental stonework that holds the glass of a stained glass window in place, overwhelms the window itself. Such exuberant artwork emphasized the handiwork of humans over that of God. In a word, humanism. Getting back to the caccia, Dr. Fassler explains to us that, quote, caccia texts always offer a narrative of a particular moment in time. They are about dogs or men on horses chasing deer or birds, often with thinly veiled references to sexual conquest, end quote. Cacciando per gustar is a raucous, humorous caccia. Dr. Fassler explains that it begins, quote, with an off-color joke at the expense of the pastoral narrator who, like so many others of his ilk wandering in and out of medieval literature, is about to have a major surprise. He is in a field of flowers, a euphemism for female genitalia, and about to touch and smell the most beautiful of the flowers when someone yells, "Shrimps!" and he is abruptly transported to a noisy urban marketplace. The musical narrative has a filmic quality, cutting from one scene to another, a technique that continues throughout the conversations in the lively Fellini-esque extravaganza, end quote. So we have come to the end of an era, a world profoundly and permanently changed by the Black Death. And we have seen this great progression from Ars Antiqua and the early polyphony of the School of Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris and the development of Franconian notation, to the Ars Nova, which allowed for additional smaller note values in the notational system, and the regularization of the forme fixe by Machaut, which spread to other courts in France, the Low Countries, Spain, Cyprus, and northern Italy. And then comes the ars subtilior, a more refined or precise art where the complexities of the ars nova become almost overwrought. As Dr. Fassler tells us, quote, the composers, artists, and scholars who created works in this style straddled the worlds of late scholasticism and early humanism, pushing on the details of their works or arguments until they engulf the whole, end quote. Let's turn back to the hilarity of Cacciando per gustar, where fishmongers and others are hawking their wares in a boisterous and very human scene. Neither God nor Mary are anywhere to be found here. The human world has become an interesting story in art. Giotto, Dante, Petrarch, Boccaccio, and Chaucer. And the body urban marketplace, with the larger social context of the economic power of the Italian states and their banking system, and flamboyant art, are all elements of this shift. Let's listen to Cacciando per gustar by Zacara.
Cacciando per di quel tesoro. Per aspri monti e boschi perigliosi d'uno scala. Ai cent'ai sopra e vetrai sfere non mai rotto, alla guerra fusa, alla merceria mirata. Ma stando dolori puvellos, e la luce grida della raspina, ali gambarelli, ali lattarini fieschi, fieschi son che anche frizzano, ali lattarini fieschi, chi ha le nuova, tutti gettano la lingua fuori. E son fieschi qui si lattarini, medui derrate di gambare gli e son fieschi questi comodici, ali fusalia dolce, all'olio, pure l'olio, che va lo petesca, che porticato, bolognesi soia, non è cinque, no, forchetti biscotti, ali buoni melangoli, come le dai, una sei soli lo cellenano e one duizza ciò che fora trista se ne alla li divone vone dare dui che voli avanti chi si vuol cirmare a Boccaccio della forma, a Boccaccio fatte, allo buono caccio fiesco, non è fiesco codici, ed è buono chi vuol, ti petti, chi vuol consigli, pettini da capo, chi vuoli scafi, all'etto chi ama l'etteramente, chi al mal vicino, al mal alla ricotta fiesca, al buon olio, più che l'ambra alle buon cerage, e chi li vuole figura, e chi li vuole buone persica, alle castagne rivoste, con cena nare tenta di canaca vienca, campire ne c'è, l'accetto, come focico, cernere, chi Madonna salvo su, alto che farina,
After listening to this piece, even if you don't understand all the words, can you hear the interruptions? Can't you just picture the chaotic street scene? In the United States, we don't really have these kinds of street markets anymore. Have you, in your travels, Ever been to such a market? Where? Let us know in the comments. I hope you've enjoyed this episode and these 2 full chapters reflecting on the Middle Ages. This episode marks the end of the Middle Ages in our journey, though we'll see later, of course, how those boundaries are not so definite. We've seen in this chapter the evolution of a stronger sense of the self, and in a way, the birth of humanism that will so strongly affect the coming art, life, and thought of what we now call the Renaissance. Please join us next time as we open a new chapter and begin to explore music of the Renaissance through the work of a fascinating group of composers known as the Franco-Flemish School, where we'll see the strong pull of the past matched by the drive for discovery and innovation. Finally, you can support us by liking this video, sharing it with friends, and leaving comments below. We really do love to hear from you. See you next time.